Mike mentioned the concept nullification and interposition. I learned everything I know about nullification and interposition from Tom Woods. I am grateful for his intellect and for the example and for the teaching that he does all across the country. Tom leads a wife and a bunch of little girls at home in Kansas to come here, be here with us today, but he travels all over the country. He's an incredible speaking schedule, an incredible writing schedule. He has long been associated with the Mises Institute out of Auburn, Alabama. If you want to delve into, you may hear the terms Keynesian and Austrian, you should think Keynesian, central control, central management, centralized management of the economy, government management of the economy. That's Keynesian economics versus Austrian economics, free market. Free market management of the economy, which is kind of a misnomer because there's no management. We don't understand those concepts. Few of us have read the Federalist and Anti-Federalist papers. They're not included in our curriculums today. And certainly the ideas of free market economies and business cycles and how those work aren't included in our curriculums today. Tom, I hope you'll take a couple of minutes to talk about not just Mises, but the educational opportunities that are available there. I know y'all are doing some innovative things with online classes, and you can go in and begin to learn and study these concepts on your own, and then be better equipped to respond to the challenges that we have in Liberty County, in the greater Houston metropolitan area, because Lord knows these regional government planning commissions are doing some serious damage maybe to our local autonomy and to the state of Texas. And so I'd like to welcome to the stage at this time Tom Woods, well-known New York Times best-selling author, educator. Tom, come and share with us.
Thanks, Deborah, ladies and gentlemen. It occurred to me recently that by far, of all the states I travel to on my various speaking engagements, by far, I'm in Texas the most. Whereas in my home state of Massachusetts, I don't get a lot of invitations. But you know what, as Kevin Gutzman knows well because of the weather up there, it's just as well. I'm happy I'm in Texas. They can stick their invitation that never came. But what I want to do is also, as with Kevin, I'll have my watch here and keep an eye on it. But I'm going to talk about another aspect of things. Deborah mentioned nullification. That's a topic that I've done an awful lot about. I have a book on this. I'm interested in this subject because it is a subject that I call it the 3x5 card of allowable opinion. There's a 3x5 card out there. And on it are written all the opinions that we are allowed to hold. All the opinions that the New York Times considers it acceptable for us to believe and support. And when you stray from that 3x5 card, they don't consider it necessary even to refute you. It's enough to point out, hey, this guy must be crazy. He's not on the officially acceptable 3x5 card of opinion written out for him by his enemies. Why would this person be so uppity? And nullification, of course, is way off that. Because, of course, the 3x5 card would say, well, the federal government has some policy. You more or less just shut up and obey. Or maybe you try to change the policy marginally. So the federal government wants to impose a 39.5% tax rate on you. Well, maybe the New York Times would think it was okay for you to advocate for a 39.2% tax rate. That would be okay to debate 39.2 versus 39.5, or should the federal government have this bit of influence or that bit of influence over your school curriculum or whatever. But to actually say, wait a minute, I'm against this whole thing, well, that's not respectable. So I've made kind of a career out of being not respectable. It turns out you can actually do this. Because there are a lot of Americans who feel like whatever the New York Times is urging me to do, I pretty much want to do the opposite. So So in fact, my one remaining New York Times story before I get started here is that, well, first of all, of course, the great thing about the New York Times these days is that there is a prospect that in our lifetimes we actually may live to see the total demise of the New York Times. Who could have dreamed of such a prospect? Even several years ago, and here it is before us, but in 2004 I had a book that unfortunately I have my book table back there, this one is not available there. I had a book come out called The Politically Incorrect Guide to American History. This book did very well. It was on the New York Times bestseller list for 12 weeks, and of course every week that it's on there, they're hating every minute of it. How dare this guy be on here? And so they actually wound up attacking the book, not in the book review section, but in a signed editorial on the New York Times editorial page, warning Americans about this book. Politically Incorrect Guide to American History. Who does this guy think he is? And at no time did they try to refute anything I said. Couldn't. So what they instead did was just say, can you believe this guy says X? And he says Y, and how can you believe he says that? As a matter of fact, I did say all those things, and I can prove them all. But the mere fact that I dared to say them, these aren't opinions that have been proved in advance by the New York Times. How dare I utter them? But the beautiful thing about it was that the book hit its highest place on the list the week after it was attacked by the New York Times. So ever since then, I've had 11 books. Ever since then, they have ignored every book since then. I got on the New York Times bestseller list again in 2009. Crickets. It was like I wasn't even named. Not even a person. Not going to let that happen. What I'm going to talk to you guys about today, though, are some other ideas that are not on the 3x5 card. But I don't think there's anything to be ashamed of. I would say if we look at the record of the so-called experts in this country, it's not a particularly good one. And we should not feel ashamed of ourselves that we're not on the same page with these people. It's a source of pride that, to me, that I don't hold the officially approved opinions of the New York Times, U.S. News and World Report. I could have said Newsweek, but Newsweek vanished last year and nobody even noticed or cared. It was sold for $1. Amazing, amazing times we live in. But the theme of my remarks today is the experts are in charge. Take cover. That's basically my theme. Because the self-appointed experts have been running things in the United States for decades now, in terms of the economy. They've had all the time in the world to arrange things just so, just the way they like it. And yet here we are in the position we're in now. The experts are in charge. But experts should have quotation marks around. The 20th century was a century, in terms of economics, of planning versus freedom. Either you had some form of government planning of the economy, or you had a free economy. Now, in a free economy, you do have planning, but it's planning by individuals. You have your plans, I have my plans, and in the arena of the market economy, they work harmoniously to produce prosperity. But I can understand why people would think that a planned economy should be more efficient. If we had a committee of people in charge of the economy, and one guy, the chairman of the committee, had a big bullhorn, and he shouted out commands to everybody, all right, you guys, you go produce the lumber, and we're going to need some green beans, so you guys go grow the green beans, and you people go build the houses, and we're going to decide exactly how many people should be building houses and using what materials and how many houses we need. It seems like that should work better. Superficially, that seems like that should work better than having a system in which everybody, without any central direction, is just making his own decisions as to what to produce, and what line of work to be in, where to produce it, using what methods and in what quantities. This seems chaotic. The Marxists call this the anarchy of production under capitalism. It's an anarchy of production because there's no guy with a bullhorn directing it. And yet, the anarchy of production, so-called, yields you vastly greater order than the planned economies of the former Soviet bloc or under communism. And this is counterintuitive, because you would think that, shouldn't it be that if we apply human reason to organizing the economy, that should be more efficient? We won't have all this unnecessary duplication, as the Marxists would say. Everything should work smoothly if we have a plan, as opposed to everybody anarchically carrying out his own goals, and yet we had the opposite. Ludwig von Mises wrote a book called Planned Chaos. That's what they had in those countries. It was planned all right, but the result was chaos. Now, why was that? Why did it not work? Ludwig von Mises, the great 20th century economist, figured this out in 1920. And if anybody had bothered to listen, they could have spared the world a whole lot of grief and mountains of corpses. But what Mises said is very simple. In the economy, you have all of us people, we all want things. We all want all different types of things. We want clothing, we want food, we want entertainment, we want housing, all sorts of things like this, and then other sorts of things we also want. And there are all different ways to provide those things for us. The clothing store could be located here or it could be located there. It could use this method of production or that method of production. It could use this ratio of inputs or that ratio of inputs. There are literally trillions of possible combinations of inputs to create the vast output of goods in the economy. How do you decide which is the correct combination? Should we use this much lumber and this much rubber, or that much lumber and this much rubber? Should we locate our physical plant over here? This would be closer to the customers, but farther from where we're getting our deliveries, or should we locate it closer to the deliveries? There are all these vast decisions to be made, and it seems like this would be impossible. Put it this way, maybe we do need a central planning committee. But in a free market economy, we're able to make these decisions. We're able to decide what goods should I produce, in what quantities, using what methods, and what inputs, and what resources, in what location, and in what quantities. We're able to do this because we have prices. And prices allow entrepreneurs to figure out, well, let's see, if I were to use this combination, probably this is not going to turn a profit. And that's society's way of saying, don't use that combination. But if I use this combination, then things should turn out okay. And it allows entrepreneurs to figure out in a rational way what's the best way to arrange the resources of society. So that, because every time we make a decision, I'm going to use these goods to produce that product, those are goods now that aren't available to be producing another product. I have to make sure that when I take stuff out of the economy to make stuff with, it's not coming at the expense of goods people value more. How do I know all this? Because prices are transmitted through all these different markets to let me calculate in my head profit and loss. Am I doing the right thing? Am I producing what the people want in ways that are least wasteful? In ways that are least wasteful in terms of opportunities for other things that I might have produced instead. This seemingly impossible problem is solved by the price system. Where does the price system come from? A committee? The price system comes from you and me. When buyers and sellers make bids and offers to each other, eventually a price is set up. And that price is meaningful and can be used to calculate profit and loss and decide what to produce. But in a centrally planned economy, you don't have this mechanism. Because in the Soviet Union or any of these command economies, the state controls what's called the means of production. The state controls all the factories, all the machinery, all the raw materials, everything that would go into producing your stuff. The state owns it all. Now, when the state owns it all, that means there's no buying and selling. You don't buy and sell something you already own. Like I wouldn't go sell myself this necktie. This would be a ludicrous exercise. It would be like a child's game. I already own it. Well, likewise, if the state owns all the factories and all the lumber and all the steel, it's never bought and sold, so prices never arise. It would be like an art auction that nobody shows up to. Where would the prices come from? No one's bidding. Well, likewise, this is like a giant auction of steel and lumber. No one shows up. There's only one owner, already owns it, so therefore there's no buying and selling, so they have no prices. They can't calculate profit and loss. They have no idea if they're doing well or badly. They have no idea if they're satisfying consumer demand. They have no idea if they're producing things in ways that are ludicrously and destructively inefficient. No way and no benchmark for comparison. They have no prices. So that's why, even though it's counterintuitive, the planners are the ones who produce the chaos, because they are operating completely in the dark. They don't have the price system. And yet the so-called anarchy of production of the free market yields you tremendous efficiencies, huge increases in life expectancy and prosperity all over the world. Now today, the Soviet style of central planning is dead, and it's not coming back. Nobody aspires to be like North Korea. Nobody. That's gone. That's dead and buried. But, the spirit of planning is still there. Kevin was talking about people who think they're smarter than we are. There are a lot of those people. Now, I don't care if people think they're smarter than I am, as long as they leave me alone. Unfortunately, these people, not only do they think they're smarter than we are, they think that because they're smarter, they should probably boss us around, second guess the decisions we make with our money, because we're stupid rubes, and we should just listen to these graduates of Ivy League universities and take direction from them. Now, I graduated from Ivy League universities, that's true. But just like Karl Marx, who was the exception to the rule, and he could perceive the great movements of history, even though he himself was not a proletarian, I sort of think of myself as the guy who somehow got out of Harvard and Columbia with his sanity, and now wants to use those universities' names against them for the rest of his life, which is my intention. What's the kind of planning we have going on in the United States or in Western Europe or indeed much of the world? Well, it's not the same thing. It's not where the state owns all the means of production. But it is this idea that we need some type of helmsman in charge of the economy. We cannot have the economy simply operate on its own. And by the economy, by the way, I'm not talking about something. The economy is you and me. The economy is just you and me buying and selling things. So when they say we need direction of the economy, they mean let's get out that bullhorn and start making decisions that override the decisions you and I want to make. And so this is what we are hearing a lot about when we hear about fiscal stimulus or monetary stimulus. We need management of the economy. If we leave you people on your own, you're just going to screw it up without us here. We've got degrees in this stuff. We know what needs to be done, so we're going to second guess your decisions. We're going to plan things with money, either borrowing it or printing it. And if we borrow and print just the right amount, we can overcome anything. We can overcome depressions, we can overcome it all. Well, let's look at what their record has been. I'm an historian, so I like to look at history. Let's start with one that they're going to consider this a low blow, the Great Depression. We're not supposed to talk about the Great Depression because we all know that that was just practice. People in government were just getting their feet wet, they were just starting out planning things, and now we're rubbing salt in the wound by picking on that one bad episode. Well, that's the way I am, you know, I'm a salt problem, you know. So when we look at the Great Depression, 1929, you get the stock market crash. Things get really bad starting in 1931. The economist Benjamin Anderson calls that the tragic year. That's when the statistics get horrendous in terms of employment and production and anything else you might care to consult. Well, what were the so-called experts saying at that time? In the 1920s, the years leading up to the Great Depression. Well, I think in particular of who was the guy who was considered like the godfather of modern mainstream economics, like the guy, the person you would most want to consult. It was a guy named Irving Fisher, Yale University, Irving Fisher. And Fisher said, all the way up to September 1929, he's saying, we're on the verge of the collapse. And he says, I see no possibility of a stock market crash at all. There's no possibility. The following month, things are getting pretty dicey. And he said, well, I believe stock prices have hit a permanently high plateau. And they're just going to stay there. So like days later, the bottom falls. I mean, stocks ultimately lose 90% of their peak value. This guy wound up losing his whole fortune in the market. Yale University had to subsidize his housing later. He was a wealthy man. He was an inventor in addition to being an economist. He invented the Rolodex. Lost his whole fortune in this. And yet this is the guy who would have been considered the most prominent, most significant economic thinker of that time. Milton Friedman even called him the greatest economist the United States ever produced. He couldn't see coming the greatest economic calamity in U.S. history. So there is no reason for us to feel intimidated by these people. Oh gosh, I'm not even entitled to an opinion, kind sir. Why don't you just instruct me on what you... No. That's long over. Now we need to be confident enough as regular people with common sense. Maybe these people don't know everything. And it turned out that one of the more despised economists, a man I've already quoted to you, Ludwig von Mises. In 1928, he said, look, all the other economists are saying, we have wonderful planning by the Federal Reserve System. It's creating just the right amount of money, and so the economy is being planned perfectly, and we're never going to have a depression again. And Mises said, sooner or later, the crash is coming. Not despite the planning of the Federal Reserve, but because of it. Planned chaos, remember. The planning is what causes the problem. The planning is not the solution to our problems, to paraphrase Ronald Reagan. The planning is the problem. Now, in my book, Meltdown, I explain exactly how it is that when the Federal Reserve intervenes in the economy and tries to improve on what you and I are doing, and tries to increase the money supply just so to make things all smooth, they actually make things worse. The planning makes things worse. So things got bad in the 1930s. What did all the experts say? All the experts intervene. We need more government programs to get us out of this thing. Now, okay, in my opinion, it was a government-supported program that got us into this thing. The Federal Reserve was created by the U.S. Congress. But now we need all these programs. And you notice that in the 1930s, that was the longest time it ever took the U.S. economy to recover. We've never had a recovery that took that long, where you've got double-digit unemployment all through the 30s. From 33 to 1940, you have average 18% unemployment. We've never had anything like that before. We had panics and depressions in the past, and there had never been any government effort to try to resolve them. And yet they always turned around. At one point or another, they always turned around. This one took forever to turn around. And so people will sometimes say, but when Franklin Roosevelt took office, we started to see some growth. You did. You still had double-digit unemployment, however. And moreover, yeah, of course you're going to see growth when you start at the lowest trough in U.S. history. There's nowhere to go but up. Yeah, that's true. There was some growth. But there's always been growth after these downturns. Why was this the one where it took the longest? Why? Could it maybe be not in spite of the government's planning? Could it be maybe because of the planning? Well, again, I've elaborated on that in some of my work. We compare this to what had happened 10 years earlier, 1920, 1921. You had double-digit unemployment, huge fall in production. At that time, you had a President, Warren Harding, who by the time it occurred to him to try to do something, the thing was over. Now, how did that happen? How did that happen? There were no planners involved. The Federal Reserve didn't really get involved until after the recovery was already underway. How did we survive without our wise overlords, right? People were supposed to bow down before we're unworthy to stand in their presence. How did we survive? If their narrative is true, we should still be in a black hole because of that. And yet, we're not. The planners told us during World War II, when the war is over, we're going to go right back into the Great Depression. Oh, why? Well, because when the war is over, we won't be spending so much money on military material and on the soldiers and all that. We won't be spending all that money. The government won't be spending as much. And if the government stops spending for the economy, okay, other people spend other than the government. That's one point to make. But it turns out that after World War II ended, 1946 was the following year, that turned out to be, contrary to what the planners told us, 1946 turned out to be the single most prosperous year that the private economy has ever had in all of U.S. history. So, I mean, you very rarely get in history an opportunity like this where there is a perfect test of an economic proposition that when this money is cut from the budget, everything's going to tank. Well, that money was cut from the budget, and the economy flourished. So you would think these people turned around and said, maybe there's something wrong with our theory. Let's go back and re-examine this and maybe shut up for a while. But you'll never guess. They didn't. They just kept on yapping. Like nothing ever had. Doesn't faze them at all. Doesn't faze them at all. Just like the most recent crisis. People who 3 weeks earlier had been saying, I think Bear Stearns is a company you want to own shares in. And then the thing, they're still yapping. They're not apologizing. They're not saying, man, I really should go on sabbatical for a while. Figure it out. No, never. People have no shame at all. But the worst time now, we get to the 1960s. This is the triumph of the planners. under Kennedy and Johnson. Because here's where you have economic advisors who believe that the economy has got, not just when things are bad, but at all times, the economy must be managed by the federal government. We have to have just the right amount of federal deficits and just the right amount of creation of new money, and we have to balance this just right to keep the economy on an even keel. So again, we leave the economy to you and me, well, it's just going to tank. So we need the experts, we need the planners, they got to decide the deficits. We need this. That's what makes the economy prosperous. In 1970, a guy you've never heard of wrote a book you've never heard of. Arthur Okun wrote a book called The Political Economy of Prosperity. Arthur Okun was one of the top economic advisors to Lyndon Johnson. And in 1970, he came out with a book explaining how they have forever gotten rid of recessions. Because we planners, we figured out how to fine-tune the economy with just enough government spending and just enough creation of money that now we're going to be like evenly balanced and there won't ever be a downturn ever again. 1 month after this book came out, the downturn started. Poetic justice, right? Perfect. 1 month after the guy says, we fixed it forever, and then we all, well, not we all, I was just a kid, but some of you guys will remember the 1970s. We don't pine for the 1970s. In any regard, by the way, not just economics, but I mean like what people were wearing, and everybody had a mustache, and whatever. Not everybody's mustaches don't suit everybody, but that's a separate matter. The point is that the planners had been dealt a devastating defeat. The 1970s, you paid for the phony prosperity of the 60s. You paid for it with inflation, stagnant wages, stagnant job growth, lousy growth figures, over and over. Horrible. In fact, the stock market, the Dow Jones lost 80% of its peak value. I mean, this was devastating. Those were the planners. But the planning gives you chaos. When you turn things over to these people who they know better than you, because they have a master's degree from wherever, that's what you wind up with. And they never apologize or resign. They just carry on. How about our most recent crash? Well, the experts there said, in 2001, let's stimulate housing. That ought to do it. And I'm talking about Alan Greenspan at the Federal Reserve, I'm talking about Paul Krugman at Princeton University. Let's stimulate housing. That ought to do it. Let's create a bubble in housing, and then we'll be doing well. So, I mean, I don't need to tell you the story of what happened. We've all lived through it. And I wrote a book, Meltdown, on what happened. That's the book the New York Times ignored. But that talks about exactly what happened. How this was not some crisis caused by the free market. That's the story they want us to believe. That, again, if you and I are left alone, look what we go and do. We blow up a housing bubble. You know, and so then, reluctantly, our wise overlords have to step in and assume more authority. They hate doing it, but they have to do it for our own good. This is such a load of, I don't know, I hate to say bad words, but you know what I'm saying. Like, this whole story is so wrong from start to finish. The primary instigator of the crisis that we just lived through was not an institution created by the free market economy. It was the Federal Reserve, and as I say, in Meltdown, I give exact nuts and bolts of how they did this. But when we look at the years that we had this housing market, 2001, 2, 3, really gets going around then, 2004, we look at those years, one of the ways we can tell this is not real prosperity is that if you look at 2001, 2007, the net number of breadwinner jobs, not part-time jobs, not McDonald's jobs, breadwinner jobs. You know the net creation of breadwinner jobs during that bubble period was? 0. That's what I mean by fake prosperity. Oh, it looks real because your house price is going up, so you think, hey, I'm rich. I'm rich, let me take out money and spend it on exotic vacations now. And then you find out you're actually not that rich. You were misled into thinking you were that rich. You were misled by the planners who know better than we do. The planners who are going to decide where interest rates should be. Because we stupid peons aren't smart enough to set them ourselves. They have to be lower than where we would set them. And that's the result. It was fake. It was fake prosperity. But that is what these Princeton people have to show for themselves. The Ben Bernankes, the Paul Krugman's, this is what they had to show for themselves, a big zero. But as it was going on, they were telling us things are great, the fundamentals are robust, housing prices will never go down, this is just a new day in housing and so on. And now, what can they think to do? What is the Federal Reserve thinking to do now? Well, we're going to have a new round of trying to stimulate housing. That's all they can think to do. So instead of having an economy that just runs, where you and I sell things to each other, buy things from each other, they're going to keep on tinkering, pushing it this way, pushing it that way, intervening. And as we've seen, the planning yields us chaos. Now, this institution, the Federal Reserve, a lot of you people in this room know about this. Some people don't. You ought to, though. The Federal Reserve was created 100 years ago. It opened its doors early in 1914. And it was supposed to give us a stable currency and stabilize the financial sector. Well, if you've looked at the headlines over the past 5 or 6 years, the record is not good. It's not good. Now, it's true that people will tell you that the Federal Reserve gave us fewer and shallower recessions. We should be glad for that. But it turns out this claim is false. In my book, Rollback, I actually give the statistics. This claim is false. The Fed has not done this. There is no silver lining with the Fed. It has been nothing but a creator of financial bubbles and devastation. Now, in the 1990s, the Federal Reserve became even more ambitious in what it was going to do. As the 20th century wore on, the Federal Reserve was given more and more responsibilities. It's supposed to have an oversight of the whole economy. It's supposed to maximize employment and minimize inflation, and maximize output, do all these things. This sounds like a central planning agency. What is this doing in a free market economy? Well, in the 1990s, they became even more ambitious. Alan Greenspan seemed to believe in something that's called the wealth effect. That if he could tinker with the economy in such a way as to make stock prices go up, this would make people feel wealthier. They look at their stock portfolios one morning and say, whoa, the stocks are way up. And they feel really wealthy. And this feeling would make them want to go out and spend and borrow more. And so this will be great. This will be the engine of the economy. A feeling that I'm wealthy. But if you're not really wealthier, a feeling isn't really going to ultimately solve your problems. And that was the problem that they began to uncover. So again, central planning instead of the market. It's got to be, we've got to change people's mentalities, make them feel rich, and then they'll blow a lot of money. That's what we want them to do. Because of this mentality, the bailouts then became necessary. Because when major institutions look like they're falling, this might have a dampening effect on the stock market, and then people won't feel rich anymore. And so they won't spend as much. We got to make them feel rich. So we got to do whatever. We got to put our finger in every hole, everywhere, to keep this thing going. So everybody will continue to feel rich. Because if stock prices start to fall, they won't feel rich. They won't spend. This is terrible. So once you start on this path, you find that it leads you to engage in more interventions and more and more and more and more to keep the whole jerry-rigged thing going. The first major example of this was in 1998. There was a company, a hedge fund called Long-Term Capital Management. Every aspect of that name was false. Long-term and capital management. There was nothing whatsoever about this firm that would in any way lead us to have any sympathy for its woes in 1998 whatsoever. It was absolutely deserved. It was a horrendous institution that for every dollar it had, it was borrowing $100 to go make risky bets. This is exactly the example of a firm that needs to fail as a warning to everybody else, don't do this. But instead, no, the Fed's got to prop everything up. The Fed arranges for a bailout of long-term capital management. And that sends a message to other major players in the financial world. You know what that message is? The message is, there is no limit to the stupidity that we will backstop and reward. You can be as stupid as you want, and the Fed's got your back. And they got that message loud and clear. In the next 15 months, the S&P 500 rose by 50% in 15 15 months. Was that because the profitability of American companies grew by 50% in 15 months? Of course not. It was because investors felt like the risks of investing have now been seriously diminished because we got this wild and crazy guy in charge of the Federal Reserve. So what type of entrepreneur does this encourage? What type of investment strategy does this encourage? Is this a free market? Are these decisions that normal people would make if their real wealth were really at stake? But all these bailouts as a result of the crash we had several years ago, they were all necessary. Because if we didn't bail out AIG and all these others, then there was going to be a contagion effect, and your local bank was going to go down, all your money would disappear, the ATMs would go dark, and you wouldn't get your paycheck, and whatever. Okay, well, that's a load of propaganda that was supposed to intimidate us into going along with these things. And to say, oh yes, wise overlords, you've never steered me wrong before. Now you want to plan some more, you go ahead and do it, and I'll just sit here and do what I'm told. That's what they wanted. And they didn't get that by and large. There was a huge outcry among the general public. And yet they did it anyway. They did it anyway. Call your congressman. Yeah, okay. I did. I called my congressman. And what happened? So that's what a lot of people felt. The Main Street banks were not in any danger whatsoever. There was absolutely no risk whatsoever of contagion of this thing spreading. Because if you just look at the balance sheets of these banks, they don't hold the type of assets that were causing the problems on Wall Street. So this was just a lie. This was an outright lie. When AIG was bailed out, 90% of AIG was perfectly solved. The other 10% could have been dealt with, as it always is, in bankruptcy. And then we looked more closely, we found out there were only about a dozen or so institutions that would have been affected by AIG going down in bankruptcy. There were only about a dozen institutions. Every one of them had more than adequate cushion for a hit like this. Way more than adequate. The AIG thing was a tiny, tiny sliver with these companies. And so AIG was bailed out not to protect you and me or to protect against a contagion effect. AIG was bailed out in order to prevent a few firms' stock prices from falling slightly or a few executives from not getting their bonus for a couple of months. That's what it boils down to. That's not the free market. That's the government. That is not, we who believe in the free market are in no way responsible for any of this stuff. Or like Morgan Stanley is in big trouble. And so the head of Morgan Stanley, John Mack, is all up in arms, demanding a bailout, demanding help, because he says that people are shorting our stock. Short sellers are taking us down. No. Your own stupid decisions are taking you down. All your creditors are abandoning you. Everybody's abandoning you because they know it's a rotten ship and they're all abandoning. But short selling is a way that average Joes can convey to other average Joes, this thing is a powder keg. This thing is a disaster waiting to happen. So of course no CEO likes to see this. So Morgan Stanley, they go to the federal government, and the federal government announces that for the next 15 days, you can buy all the financial stocks you want, but you're not allowed to sell them. There is no institution in the country other than the government that would have the authority to do that. Plus $100 billion too. And then things turned around. Now these were institutions that absolutely, fundamentally deserved to go down. They were the exact example of what not to do, how not to run a company. But instead, the same people are in charge, the same strategies are being pursued, and it goes on. In the course of doing all this, the Fed created a huge amount of money to buy these bad assets. These are real estate-related assets. So they're called mortgage-backed securities. These assets were going bad because the values of the houses were connected to them were going down. And we've got to get these bad assets off the books of these big institutions. So the Fed just creates the money out of thin air and buys them. Now, the thing is, the Fed buys them, creates the money, throws this money into the economy. Now, right now, that money, by and large, is sitting there. Most financial institutions are too scared at this moment to do much lending or do much with that money. So they're sitting there. But when that money finally starts being lent out, that's where the problem comes, because that's where inflation happens. Because one bank lends money to somebody, that person deposits the money in another bank, that bank uses that money to lend to somebody else, while still claiming to have it on demand for this person, so they're creating new money, and then the next bank creates new money. This is where inflation gets started. And so the Fed says, well, don't worry about it. When that process starts, we'll take all this new money that we created and take it back. Well, how do they do that? The only way they can take it back is by selling something for the money. What are they going to sell? All these real estate assets. But if they throw all these real estate assets on the market, they're going to make housing fall again. So they're in a completely impossible situation. They all claim they've got some secret plan to turn things around at just the right moment. There's no secret. Yeah, the secret plan is resign, retire, and move halfway around the world and change your name. Grow back your 70s mustache and just blend in. That's the plan. And then finally, all this money creation over decades, the Fed just creates money, throws it into the banking system. This distorts the economy. There are decisions that are made that wouldn't have been made otherwise. With interest rates super low, people make decisions they wouldn't have made otherwise. And there are firms and industries and lines of production that are started up that can only continue if the Fed keeps pumping in this fake money. That's the only way they can continue. So if the Fed ever were to stop doing this, there would be a wrenching change in the economy as the economy readjusts to the real pattern of real demand, not fake money being spent and businesses being built up to produce products based on that fake money. When real people are spending their real money that they really earn, we're going to see some industries were bubble industries. They have to be rearranged, they have new products produced. And then finally, the budget. So it's not just the economy per se, it's also the federal budget. We all know the problem with the federal budget. By 2020, you know how much is going to be spent just on the interest on the national debt? $1 trillion a year in interest. So $1 trillion a year, basically, you're opening up a window and just throwing $1 trillion out the window for interest payments. And that assumes that interest rates stay low. What if they go higher? What if they double? $2 trillion. $2 trillion on interest. That's going to be a tricky issue to deal with. Worse than that are the numbers given by the Boston University professor Larry Koplikoff. He studies what are the unfunded liabilities of the major transfer programs like Medicare, Social Security. Those are underfunded. And he says the present value of the amount that they're underfunded is $222 trillion. Now, he comes up with this figure every year. Last year it was $211 trillion. And it's just ignored. No one ever deals with it. It's just ignored. Now, that doesn't mean that's the amount that we're going to owe over the years. Present value means you would have to invest $222 trillion right now and get a 5% return on it annually to be able to make all these payments. Now, the federal government does not have $222 trillion lying around. There's no coin they could mint to solve that problem. So this is, I would say, this is the biggest problem that's being fixed because everybody expects these programs to be, and inevitably, I mean, this isn't just, oh, I'm a fearmonger and I like to make people scared. This is beyond a shadow of a doubt that the federal government will not be able to fulfill all these promises. There is absolutely no chance whatsoever they will be able to fulfill these promises. So how are they going to try? Some people think they're going to tax us to death. But we've seen in U.S. history that there's only a certain amount of the economy that the federal government can tax. It can only get about 20% of GDP out of us. And they can get a little bit above that once in a while, but once they start taxing that much, people start hiding their income, or they don't work as much, or whatever. They put their money in tax-free stuff, or whatever. So there's only so much they can tax. They can't possibly continue to borrow over $1 trillion a year, every single year. Who's going to be lending that money? Japan has its own demographic problems. China has demographic problems. They don't have this money to spare. Where's it going to come from? The Fed could just create all of it. We could have hyperinflation. But I think that's unlikely. Because the Fed knows that is not a long-term solution. Hyperinflation could last for 4 months. But this unfunded liability problem goes on for 75 years. A 4-month reprieve doesn't help anything. And by the way, why does hyperinflation not last very long? Because if you realize the money isn't worth anything, you don't use it. You use anything else. Use a foreign currency, silver, whatever. People wouldn't be using the dollar for long enough for that even to work. But the most likely outcome now is that the older folks are going to get the shaft. There's just no doubt about this at some point. That's going to happen. And there's going to be tremendous turmoil as a result of this. And we need to be ready at the county level to respond when this inevitably happens, to help people. Because people are going to be displaced, they're going to have their expectations radically altered, and they're going to need help. And they're going to find that there is nobody to help them. The federal government does not have the funds to do it. That they write checks, and the checks aren't worth it. And we are going to have to figure out ways, as human beings, one person to another, to help each other. And thankfully, the American tradition can be called into service in this. Because over 150 years ago, getting close to 200 years ago, Alexis de Tocqueville, who was the greatest, most astute foreign observer of the United States, one of the things that he noticed was that a lot of projects that in Europe would take a government agency to resolve, in the United States, he says, I find there are always voluntary associations that come together to solve the problems. That's what we're going to have to do, because we're going to have no other choice. We are going to be put back on our own resources. Now, finally, on the other side of this, I think we are going to see a couple of very good things. Number one, widespread mistrust of government. When there is a default on this scale, people are not going to believe it. And this is going to happen all throughout the Western world, especially because the demographics guarantee it. They're not having enough babies to support this system, especially, even worse than this can't possibly continue. And people are just not going to believe it. We will get this albatross off from around our necks. And I believe that as a result, we will have, without this awful foreboding hanging over us, we can have a robust economy. When the Federal Reserve will get to a point where it will say, we are not bailing out the Treasury anymore. That you're just going to have to cut spending and do whatever, but that's it. And at that point, we can have a prayer of getting back to a real economy, not one that's goosed with fake money and artificially low interest rates and all this manipulation that gives you nothing but bubbles and disaster. But a real economy where we actually are allowed to make our decisions without our overlords second-guessing us and planning. We have a chance of a real, robust economy. But even now, even before the crash, even before this fiscal collapse, already the experts are in trouble. Because the so-called experts have told us for decades that the way to solve unemployment is by government deficits. And yet, for 40 years, in Europe, what have we seen? Government deficits and unemployment. It has not worked. I mean, I can give you theoretical reasons why it's not going to work, but what most people care about is in reality doesn't work. And in Europe, it has been decades of unemployment. In the United States, we've had year after year of $1 trillion+ deficits, and unemployment is still stubbornly high. And that's even after they've manipulated the numbers. They take out the discouraged workers, people who've given up bothering to try to find a job. They don't even count them anymore. It's not working. Now, my challenge to you is this. It's not enough to say, I had a great time at the Cleveland Civic Center today. Now I'm going to go forget all about it. I don't want you to leave saying, well, that was kind of interesting, or I knew some of this stuff, but now I've been fortified in it. I want you to learn more, because there are a lot of things that you can do that will help. You could join the 10th Amendment Center, which is a great organization. You could join Oath Keepers if you are involved in law enforcement or the military. It's a great organization. Or if you're just sympathetic to people who want to keep to their oaths. You could join We Texans with Deborah Medina here. There are all kinds of things you can do. There's no shortage of things. What can I do? Well, I just gave you a few examples. But one indispensable thing is education. That is indispensable. We have to really know this stuff because we have to persuade people. This is not optional. We have to persuade people. We have to alert people to what is going to happen. And a lot of times people say, well, economics is kind of boring. I've never understood this. The fact that I am getting ripped off, I don't find boring at all. I find that quite interesting. I'm quite absorbed by it. So what I've done is I've put up a free resource, because what I've been talking about today, I've been sort of hinting at it, but there is a school of free market economic thought. Deborah mentioned the Austrian School of Economics. These are the people who actually tried to tell everybody what was going to happen. This is what Ludwig von Mises belongs to. And so I set up a page, learnaustrianeconomics.com. And you just learn the stuff. It's just simple books to read. You can get them for free on simple things to listen to. You can listen to them for free. But also, Kevin and I have our own little venture where we are teaching not only economics, but also U.S. history, real U.S. history, not the phony, baloney, politically correct kind, but the real U.S. history, real Western civilization, taught by people who kind of like Western civilization. How about that? And we keep adding courses over and over, and it's called libertyclassroom.com. And we've right now got 6 courses. Kevin is finishing up a 7th, a course on the Constitution, the real thing. And then you can ask us, you can learn in your car. Nobody has time to sit in front of a computer screen. You learn while you're driving your car. Learn liberty while you're driving your car. So we've got 6 courses. We get discussion forums. You can ask us anything you want for a whole year. And to join, it is much, much less than you would spend for even 1 credit hour at a community college. I mean, it's a steal. And plus, I have a coupon for it back there, so it's even more of a steal. It's like you're taking food from me. It's how much a steal it is. That's okay, I grow my own food. That's not true, I just made that up to make you feel better. But ultimately, that's what we need to do. The self-appointed experts and the planners have put us into this bind. And all we've had is what Mises predicted, planned chaos. Instead, let's go back to our individual plan, where we all act as free, sovereign individuals and give not planned chaos, but real and genuine freedom for ourselves